string quintet.
It's much more romantic than anything I expected to hear you play, Glenn.
This is the most wonderful thing he ever wrote, I think. The only thing in which you can't have the tubas blasting out every climax, you know. Puts him under a greater discipline than he ever was in any other work. Marvelous music.
Since it's written for the stringed instruments, I suppose you can only play it for yourself.
Well, I have more pleasure playing Bruckner on the piano than most other things of that generation that were written for the piano, as a matter of fact.
Most of the recordings you've done, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, so on, people think of as classical or else modern, altogether modern, Schoenberg, Webern. Actually, are you enlarging your repertory now?
Well, you know, what I played in public and what I played for myself have always been two quite different things. I have pretty well been familiar with the popular piano repertoire ever since I was a teenager. As a matter of fact, in my days of glory around 12 and 13, I used to give all Chopin Liszt recitals. Those were tremendous events. But when I was about 16, I began to going through a sort of selective process. I think everybody does at a certain point, and usually in their late teens, and this was it for me. And I started weeding the things out that, not that I liked less, but that liked me less, you know, that meant less to me really, and showed it. And so at this point, I suddenly dropped from my active repertoire all of these things which had been war horses up until then, and up until a point which I had enjoyed playing. But at the same time, as this occurred, I also became extremely interested in the literature of the late 19th century, the orchestral literature, the Strauss, Mahler, Bruckner, Wagner area. And I began making, for myself and for fun, piano transcriptions of things like the Schoenberg Chamber Symphonies and things of this kind, and Wagner and so on. And it was a great pastime, and also it put me in touch with this literature. And to me, it's a source of greatest regret, really, that the people that I admire most at the turn of the century, Mahler and Strauss and so on, wrote nothing of consequence for the piano. Strauss has one small work for the piano with orchestra, the Burlesque.
Which you have played.
Which I played quite often.
Mm-hmm.
But apart from that, nothing from his mature years, and Mahler has nothing at all, really. Mm-hmm. And I'm convinced that those two especially, and perhaps Mahler in particular, could have written magnificently for the piano, if only because he had such a wonderfully defined sense of instrumental texture. You know? Mm-hmm. It's a tragedy.
You're playing Brahms concerto this winter on your tour.
Mm-hmm, for the first time.
It's the first time? Which one?
The D minor.
Where's this tour going to take you?
Well, this winter I'm in North America, mostly in the United States, some concerts in Canada, and again for about 6 weeks in Europe.
Whereabouts in Europe?
Germany, Italy, Belgium, England, France.
How many European tours have you done by now?
That one will be the, sixth.
Uh-huh. When did you do the first one?
Well, the first one was only in 1957. I've been averaging 2 a year. They haven't really been, with one exception, tours in the grand sense. They have usually been 1 month, 2 month visits, and which is about all I can afford the time for. Yeah. But the first one was in 1957. That was the one which I went to Russia.
Do you know now how many concerts actually you'll be giving this winter?
I would say I'm cutting down. This last winter, I had a terrible time. I thought I was worked to death. I did something like 65. But this year, I think it won't be more than about 55.
That's still a lot of work.
Well, it's a lot, but not in the tradition of people like Hoffman and Rubinstein, who play or used to play 100 concerts a year. This is child's play, really, but it's all I can stand.
Do you enjoy touring?
No, I it's perhaps exaggerating to say I loathe it, but next thing to it. It's a very great strain. As you begin to feel your age, as I am at present, the responsibility seems greater than it once did. At one time it came very close to being a lark, but it no longer is so. And it's something to be taken very seriously, and the constant tension of this schedule is indeed a very great strain. Mm-hmm.
Actually, apart from the hard work, Is there any relaxation on a tour like this? As a traveler, do you get to see much of the place?
I'm a very bad tourist. I tend to get like a horse with blinders on when I'm in places where I'm supposed to admire because of their scenic beauty. I could be in the most... I once was. I once spent a week in the summer in the Colorado Rockies where I had to give a performance, and fantastically beautiful though it was, I really didn't see a thing because I simply sat and looked at my scores and felt ashamed of myself afterwards, because in the midst of this incredible scenery, one should forget fidelity to the music.
What about Russia? They didn't let you just sit and look at scores there, did they?
Well, they tried not to, and in fact, I really did a bit of sightseeing there, because that was like so much like being on the other side of the moon that not to take advantage of it would have been a catastrophe. But there again, I didn't see nearly as much as I wanted to. But I wandered around quite a bit, and quite freely, unrestricted.
You played in Moscow
and Leningrad.
Just the two cities? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Did you meet Russian musicians while you were there?
Oh, yes, quite a lot.
I mean, apart from performers, did you meet any of the composers?
Yes. A number of the composers were on some kind of diplomatic goodwill missions. I remember Khachaturian was, and... Shostakovich was there. I met his son, but I didn't meet Shostakovich. But I met a great many of the composers whom I had never heard of, and I think people here had never heard of either. Uh-huh. Some, in fact, I would say a good many, that struck me as being much sounder craftsmen than the people of whom we hear a great deal.
Really?
Yeah.
Are they in touch with the 12-tone school? Are they actually influenced by it?
Not influenced at all, although one hears curious stories about twilight meetings of young composers who play this music for themselves. We can only imagine with what reaction that do go on, that do exist. But it's very hard to know if this is true or not. One hears, curious rumors about composers who work as garbage collectors in order to earn a living and are in no way subsidized, and then go on writing 12-tone music. But I gave a lecture, uninvited more or less, at the Moscow Conservatory, and subsequently repeated it at Leningrad, on loosely called Music in the West, but in point of fact I dealt almost entirely with the Viennese school, 12-tone composers. And this was a real cause célèbre. A couple of old professors got up and led a demonstration by walking out, because my text had not been announced, needless to say, and I was doing it through interpreters who were frightfully embarrassed and whose jobs were probably in danger. No, I don't think so. But in any case, it was a very interesting experience, because I was terribly curious to see what would really happen. And afterwards, a number of young composers and executants came and said that they had really been terribly curious to hear this music, because apparently, to a point, Schoenberg and I think even Webern exist in their libraries as curios, in the same way that studies of American social planning might be observed at the Kremlin, mm-hmm. but observed in exactly that same detached
mm-hmm.
way, and they never actually heard it in performance. Mm-hmm. And it was, for them, exciting to hear this music for the first time actually played, and in fact, had I been there longer, I would have loved to had time to sort of get together individually in groups and talk with them, Not in any sense to propagandize, but just to get their reactions.
What did you actually play in Moscow?
I was, outside of these lectures, I was extremely conservative. Not that I had to be, I wasn't told to be, but I decided that it was partly for my own benefit to be, and presumably they probably wanted something that to an extent they knew, and so I played a great deal of Bach, although a lot of it was Bach which they probably had not heard very often on the piano, the Goldberg Variations, some of the Art of the Fugue, some of the partitas, and concertos with the orchestras, and a lot of Beethoven, which of course they do know very well, and some Brahms. What else? I played some contemporary music.
What contemporary?
Well, on the regular recitals, very conservative contemporary music, early Alban Berg, Hindemith, things like that.
Uh-huh. You mentioned Bach. Are they familiar with Bach in concert? Or is
yes,
an academic thing?
Very much so. Although, in some ways, I think that they are perhaps 40 years behind the North American understanding of Bach. It's really in the last couple of generations that people have begun to consider Bach as regular table fare and not museum pieces.
And not just finger exercise.
Yes, and I don't think that they by any sense regard it as museum music. In fact, they apparently have a tremendous devotion for Bach. But having played Bach with them there, with the Leningrad Philharmonic, they are quite evidently afraid of it. It's something to be so revered and put on such a high elevation that it cannot be properly approached, you know. And they take very literally certain things which are here to be regarded with a grain of salt. The idea that Bach did not indulge in dynamic markings, in crescendos and diminuendos, and in anything between piano and forte, indicates to them that therefore everything is either piano or forte, that there are no shades of grays whatever, and that instead of taking the plateaus on which Bach wrote as ultimates and things to be attained by gradation, they take it as absolutes and things to be attained by pulling out a new stop, you know. In that sense, it's a sort of neo-Baroque attempt, but I don't think it's really an attempt. I have a feeling it's more a paralysis, you know, of imagination. From unfamiliarity, yes.
Yeah. You were, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the first Canadian artist to go to Russia, weren't you, after the war?
Yes, I think so.
Would you like to go back, actually?
Yes, I would. The problem is that if I went back, it would be for a longer period of time. That was what we decided when I was there with them. And to find that period of time and to look forward to a time when you are really rushed off your feet, which is what it is there. It is a tremendous series of parties and receptions and toasts and vodka and that sort of thing, which my constitution can't really stand, you know. But nevertheless, I really want to go back, and I will one of these times.
Yeah. What about Russian performers? You presumably talked to some of them while you were there.
Yes, a good many. Now I met, let me see, the most famous pianist in Russia. He's never been outside of the Soviet Union, or in any case, Eastern Europe. I met Sviatoslav Richter, who is known here only as a legend and by a few recordings, which don't do him justice at all. He is practically an idol. Not practically, he is an idol in Russia. An incredible man, a wonderful person, a wonderful human being, and a marvelous, marvelous pianist.
Did you find yourselves worlds apart musically, or?
No, that was an amazing thing. I had several chances to talk with Richter, who was extremely affable and much more open than are most of the Russian musicians to conversation. And in fact, I can remember that at one banquet at the Metropole Hotel in Moscow, we got onto the subject of Schoenberg, whom he said he did not like. And I asked him why, and it was not the party explanation. It was a personal, a real. At least it was an explanation of someone who had made the attempt, you know, to discover and had rejected for himself, which was very encouraging. I mean, he was a person of great mental agility, really, and had very good reasons for what he said.
We hear lots of stories about Russian audiences being extraordinarily vociferous, and when they like somebody, they make a point of rushing down the aisle and so on. Did you find this?
Yeah, this is true. I don't know that it's an especially good sign. It is certainly a sign of great warmth. I don't think it's necessarily a sign of great erudition. When it happens to you, you enjoy it. I mean, you are part of this thing, and it's hard to resist them, you know. When you look back at it later, you wonder how much it really means, because it's true that they don't do it universally. They are, to an extent, restricted on who they rush down the aisle for, but nevertheless, it happens often enough that it doesn't mean you are the greatest thing that ever happened. You know, it simply means that we like you very much and thank you, kind of thing. There also seems to be, or at least was in my case, unwritten law that the average concert public do not come backstage after a concert in the way they do here. At least none of them ever did. It was always musicians and authorized personnel who did. And so this contributes in part, I should think, to the habit they have of standing around the stage door, because it's their only contact with you, you know.
Glenn, what about audiences elsewhere? Do you find by and large that there's much difference between an audience in the United States, an audience in London, where you've just been, or an audience in Toronto?
Well, I don't notice great differences, because an audience collectively doesn't mean very much to me. I don't think that I'm able to make any real comparison, because it seems to me that an audience is there for only one purpose, and that is to listen. They are not there to respond. They are not there to applaud. As far as I'm concerned, I have always hope to fulfill an ambition when I'm 60 that I had when I was 16, and that was to found my own concert series in my own concert hall in which it would be verboten for the audience to respond in any way, to applaud, to jeer, to whistle, to do anything.
This sounds positively Wagnerian.
Oh, it was. It was. And I was very intense about it in those days, and I still think it would be an extremely good idea. Because it seems to me that applause and response of any kind is not only a misleading thing, it can be a vicious instrument. It can be an instrument that can cause a lot of people who are easily impressed by their own success to go astray. It can also discourage many who are somewhat more weak-willed. And altogether, I think it should be done away with.
Are you saying that audiences actually can affect your performance in the sense that they can influence you to show off, say, or to do something?
Definitely. I have tried to make it so that in the last few years I've worked very hard to convince myself that the audience, for all practical purposes, does not exist, that I'm playing really for myself, and that getting up and taking your bow is simply a formality that has to be gone through and not something to be concerned about in any way. I mean, this sounds like hokum, but it really is. It really can be done. I'm convinced of it. In fact, my own feeling now about an audience is much more one of healthy indifference, not antagonism, and certainly not disdain, but one in which they are simply invited to sit in on something that is happening in any case for yourself. You know, this is the only way in which you can really be at ease and I think in intimate contact with the audience, actually, because you have to consider them individually, not for their mass response. It is just as if you were playing for a few friends who unfortunately got too many, you know.
Mm-hmm. Does it follow that you actually will enjoy a recording session more where you have relative privacy?
Much more.
You do enjoy them?
Oh, yes. Well, you know, in my teens, I was going to school, and I played almost not at all in public. My only performances, really, for many years, were performances on the CBC, who were extremely good to me. And I got so used to working with a microphone that the microphone, instead of becoming an enemy, as it does for many people, it became a friend. I really think that this is not so common, because I know most people fear and detest the microphone, and it's most unfortunate, because when you get to feel at ease with it, it becomes the most relaxed and intimate medium there is. Recording is a wonderful joy to me, because it's the closest thing to recreation that we have, really.
Yet actually, it has its own strains, though, surely, that you haven't got complete control of the environment, and you don't.
No, but when do you have in life?
Well, true, but in the concert hall, it's always seemed to me that well, this is perhaps influenced by thinking about the theater, that the audience conditions, it sets the emotional climate, and it can inspire the performance in some way or other. I don't know, does this apply to music? It certainly does to the actor.
It does to most people, apparently, to most performers that I know. And, I mean, you cannot disagree with them, because they feel it as strongly as I feel the other way. But for me, the audience inhibits the performance to an extent, not to a serious degree, but to an extent that can, if you work at it, be overcome. I'm speaking now, you know, entirely personally. Mm-hmm. But the recording, on the other hand, does nothing of the kind, because you are alone in the studio. There are no external things to be considered. You don't have to think in terms of meeting somebody's particular likes and dislikes and demands. You can only meet your own. And then the playback aspect of recording is a very satisfying thing, too, because you can listen to many different variants of the same thing and find the closest thing to the ideal, never the ideal, but the closest to it that you are able to achieve at that particular moment in your life. And when it is released, unless there are some particular reason for it, it ought to be as close as possible to what you would ideally like to do, you know. It does happen that in concert you, for some reason or other, will get a better performance than anything you've done on recording, but I don't think that's attributable to the audience. It just happens that maybe you know it a little better by then.
Yeah. Can you remember the first concert you ever went to?
Yeah, I can, I think. It was Hoffman. I was about 6 years old, and it was, I think, his last performance in Toronto. And it was a staggering impression, really. The only thing I can really remember is that when I was being brought home in the car, I was falling asleep, and I was in this wonderful state of half awakeness, in which you heard all sorts of incredible sounds going through your mind, and they were all orchestral sounds, but I was playing them all, and I suddenly was Hoffman, I was enchanted. And this was something I'll never forget.
Had you any idea at the time that you would be a concert pianist?
No, I don't think so.
You hadn't thought of it?
Well, not in terms of that aspect of the business. I was already playing the piano and loving it, but it was just for myself,
Mm-hmm. Who were your musical idols? I'm speaking of performers now.
Well, when I was in my teens, which is the time when one has idols, I guess, I really only had one. I'm not speaking of performers, and that was Schnabel, on whose Beethoven, and to a lesser extent Schubert and Brahms, I was brought up.
His recordings or
Oh, the recordings, yes, I never heard him in public.
You didn't hear him?
Never.
No. What was it about Schnabel particularly that attracted you?
Well, I think in part it was the idea that Schnabel seemed to be a person who didn't really care very much about the piano as an instrument. The piano was a means to an end for him, and the end was to approach Beethoven. And I can remember when I was about 12 or 13, I began to learn the G major Beethoven concerto, which was the first piano concerto I ever learned and the first one I ever played. And I started to ape Schnabel's recording to such a degree that I think it was finally taken away from me by my teacher for a month of thinking about my failures, because I was pulling tempi around in the most incredible rubatos. I mean, outdoing Schnabel by about 2 to 1 in every case.
Mm-hmm. I suppose that's an enormous temptation, particularly when you have recordings and can play them over and over again to actually mimic somebody rather than to study them.
Well, yes, I mean, at that age, I think it's a temptation for everyone. But at the same time, I think it's a marvelous thing that, well, in my teens, it certainly there weren't by any means as many things on the market as there are today. But I think it's a marvelous thing that children can have this.
How old were you when you played this Beethoven concerto?
I was 12 or 13.
When did you actually start studying piano?
Oh, I was playing when I was about 3 or 4, but just diddling away, really. And I didn't become very serious about it, I think, until I was perhaps 10 or 11 when I really began to work. At that time, I would say, with the idea of a career, rather vaguely.
Had you always been able to read music?
Well, I learned very young. I learned when I was perhaps 3 or 4, I could read music before I could read words.
And when you actually started, what had you in mind? Was it just the ordinary training that a child goes through, or did you actually have serious intentions?
Well, I don't think that at that time I had a very clear idea of what a career in music involved. I don't think that students usually do. In fact, to their misfortune, students by the time they graduate still don't have a very clear idea of what it involves. I think that it was an extraordinarily glamorous aura surrounded the whole thing in my early school days, my grade school days, because for one thing, it was something to sit and think about when I was bored with the teacher, as I always was. And it also was a wonderful escape from my fellow students, whom I always was getting wrong with. And I think those were the things that music conjured for me much more than what it meant for the future. It sort of was an endless continuation of that kind of event or escape.
Did you enjoy practicing?
Yes, because probably for those same reasons. I don't think I enjoyed the physical labor of it any more than the next fellow. But I think again it had somewhat more suspect roots.
Had there been music in your family?
Well, not professionally for about 3 generations. Our one claim to fame musically is that Edvard Grieg was a first cousin of Mother's grandfather.
A good lineage.
Well, unfortunately, I don't like his piano concerto, because if I did, it would be the publicity stunt of the century.
Do you remember what you played at your first concert? Your first recital?
On the piano?
Yeah.
Well, my first concert with orchestra was, as I mentioned before, the G major Beethoven concerto. That I can very much easily remember. The first recital is a rather difficult problem.
How old were you at the time?
I was, well, the first complete recital. I took part in many other recitals with other young students, but I think the first recital was when I was about 14. Yes, I think I played a brace of Bach fugues and some Haydn, some Beethoven, some Chopin, some Mendelssohn, some Liszt,
Which you haven't played since in public?
Which I haven't played since in public.
Were you nervous?
Not nearly as nervous then as I am today.
Really?
Oh, no.
Why?
Well, it was all part of the game. One sort of, the audience was largely filled with my schoolmates anyway, who had heard me do the same thing at the auditorium, and first period every Friday morning kind of thing. Yeah. And after all, if I could get through it there, there's no reason I couldn't have got through it again. In those days, one is sort of blissfully unaware of the responsibility that this thing entailed. I just wish I could feel like that again. Now you have to accomplish the same thing by sedatives.
What about other musical attractions? You played the organ at one time.
Well, the organ was a great influence, not only on my later taste in repertoire and selectivity of repertoire, but I think also on the physical manner in which I tried to play the piano. It was an invaluable training. It's something that I think a lot of people could profit by. First of all, as far as the repertoire is concerned, there isn't, speaking practically, very much one can play on the organ except music of the Baroque until you get to the 20th century. Nothing of distinction. There are many minor figures, all of whom come out sounding like Mendelssohn usually, even the French. But for that reason, I was playing the organ when I was around 9 or 10 for the first time, and I was playing mostly, I would say no, altogether, to be quite honest, Bach and Handel. And this was a terrific influence, because at that time I hadn't shown any special predilection for music of the Baroque on the piano. And it was really, I think, through the organ that this interest began, and was simply transferred to the piano, and so I was simultaneously struggling with the 48 preludes and fugues and the liturgical year,
You studied organ here, did you do
Yes.
it? Mm-hmm. Whereabouts?
At the Royal Conservatory in Toronto.
Mm-hmm. Who was your teacher?
Frederick Sylvester.
Mm-hmm. And then, did you switch to the piano afterwards?
No, I was playing the piano at the same time. It was a question of trying to combine this with going to school, which got very difficult, and eventually something had to give, and it was the organ that gave. But by that time, certain aspects of organ playing, the physical aspects of organ playing, had made a great impression upon me. One of them was the fact that when you are dealing with absolute dimensions of sound that are manufactured for you, when the sound cannot be manufactured by any force of the fingers without changing another stop, without pulling out a 16-foot coupler or a 2 2/3 mixture, when you were dealing with things that were absolutely set, the only way in which you could establish or enhance a felicity of phrase was to do some kind of rhythmical pause, a breath, so to speak, within the finger, within the muscular mechanics of the hand. And so in this way, I learned that when you played Bach, the only way to establish a phrase, a subject, a motive of any kind, was not to do as one would do with Chopin, to make a hairpin, a curve, dynamic crescendo or diminuendo in the middle of the thing, but was to establish it by rhythmic gasps and breaths. And in other words, that when we're playing the art of the fugue, let's say, you do not play it. Which it would seem to be, if it were Chopin, I mean, one could only imagine it as... That is not Chopin, but if it were that repertoire, if it were something from the 19th century, one would play it that way. But when it was Bach, one had to have an entirely different approach, something that was based really on the tips of the fingers, doing the whole action for you, something that could be, almost have the wonderful whistling gasp of the tracker action of the old organs of the... and so on, so that the whole dimension of expressions generally was accomplished exactly in this way, and without any, or practically none of the slurrings and the overphrasings, and not to even speak of pedalings, in which Bach is so often played on the piano. And I really feel that this was entirely due to the fact that I was trained in the organ.
This is very interesting, and something I must say I'd never thought of. Develop a piano style or an interpretive approach to Bach from the experience of having done it on the organ.
Yes, well, harpsichordists have very much the same asset, really, except that there they are dealing with an instrument in which the action of the keys, the repeat action, is so light and so fast that it's rather like playing an electric typewriter by comparison. And they very often find when they come to the piano that they haven't got the constancy of control they would like on the piano, whereas the organ, while it is a confusing action in some respects, is much closer to the piano than is the harpsichord. And in fact, organs vary greatly, but generally the weight of the key is not so very different from the average weight of a concert grand. And so in this way, one gets a certain muscular memory for what a keyboard is, and the two things can be put together.
So you made a decision then to let the organ be for a while and concentrate on the piano.
Well, my last venture as an organist was here in Toronto. I think I gave a Bach recital. I was about 15 at Grace Church on the Hill, I think. And that was my last public appearance, my farewell appearance. And then I retired. A blaze of glory.
Do you want to play it again sometime?
Oh, I've got a great hankering to play it again. I'm going to take off a summer one of these years, not too very far distant, I think, and get my feet back in shape, because they go out very quickly and very badly, and play some of the Bach trio sonatas and record them, I think.
When did you get the idea that you would like to be a composer?
I think I always had it, because I was always fiddling around with great concoctions ever since I can remember. In fact, there are more drawers at my home filled with ancient masterpieces, usually of about 1 page duration, planned for 64 and suddenly abandoned at the end of one. I found that this technique wasn't satisfactory, so I moved on to another.
Are they for full orchestra or piano?
They're usually, like a lot of Bach scripts, they're usually for nothing in particular. They usually cannot be reached accessible to 10 fingers, and they can be just attacked as best the floundering hand can.
But actually, you've written one string quartet which has been performed.
Yes.
And what else?
A lot of things which I don't talk about anymore, because I went through a 12-tone period in my late teens and early 20s, and the works of that era, not because they are 12-tone, but simply because I was not particularly convinced with what I did with the medium, are now put into mothballs. The things that I've done in the last few years have been altogether in a rather surprising arch-romantic idiom, very much influenced by people like Bruckner, and most especially, I think, of all by Richard Strauss, who is my great god in the 20th century.
And are you interested in writing for the keyboard or for voice? Or?
Well, I'm writing something for voice with the keyboard, which I'm trying to stop making it sound like a string sextet, because every time I write for the keyboard, my old organist habit of thinking in terms of the cello line or the bass line or the left-hand line in the foot pedals gives me the disconcerting notion that you can really write greater stretches than the hands are able to accomplish, so that I've never been able to write successfully for the piano. I wrote some cadenzas once for the C major Beethoven concerto, which I even recorded with them, and they're fiendishly difficult to play.
Which you use yourself?
Well, I use them myself. I've always hoped that somebody else is going to play them. Nobody has it yet. I'm still waiting.
Do you actually mean to play less and write more?
Oh, yes. Definitely.
When do musical ideas come to you? Do they come suddenly, or do you discover them at the piano, or...?
No, I don't discover them at the piano. I find that the piano leads you astray. The more you fiddle around, the more the fingers give you nauseating ideas of what can sound right, and they're mostly illogical ideas. They're not based upon the real hard facts of life as far as making music is concerned. They're ideas that come too easily or too facile. It's a great joy to sit down after you've written something that you're pleased with and realize it fully on an instrument that you like. You can realize it much more fully, actually, in your imagination in any case in your head when you're writing it. But just the fact of hearing it reproduced is a great thrill. But I think it's something to be avoided when one's actually writing. At least for me, it is.
Mm-hmm. What about your string quartet? Where has it been played?
It's been played here at Stratford. In fact, its premiere was there. It's been played in Montreal. It's been recorded by the CBC for their overseas library.
Is it possible to play any of it on the piano?
Oh, it can be done, especially if I have a standby cellist playing the bass line with me.
Which you haven't got.
Would you like to try?
I'll follow the score, and then if I make any mistakes,
Right.
nobody will know.
It's almost impossible with 10 fingers, but the quartet was an attempt to build a very, very big structure out of the old proposition of the classical sonata allegro. And in fact, this work is, for all its many sections, is really one sonata allegro movement with three very clear sections: the exposition, the development, the recapitulation, and a coda, which alone is over 300 bars long. And as you can imagine, all this takes about 35 minutes. It didn't completely come off. 3 years of my life went into this thing, and I'm extremely proud of it. But it didn't completely come off, first of all, because I didn't know at that time many things that I ought to have known about what the strings can and cannot do in terms of niceties of technique. And I was thinking again in terms of a blank instrumentation, really. But on the whole, I'm very pleased with it, because I had one idea in mind, which I think to a point came off, and that was to build a work in which one small motivic cell, in this case one of 4 notes being this, would to a large extent govern all of the themes and all of the motives of principal importance in the entire work. And in fact, whole sections are based upon nothing but this motive put in every conceivable light and upside down and backwards and all kinds of things. And this was, in a sense, a heritage from the 12-tone people whom I had studied and admired very much, because it was really the same kind of principle working, the idea that out of the smallest nucleus, out of one cell really, should spring a work. At the same time, idiomatically, what I did was to try and fit this notion into a harmonic texture that could have been quite easily, I would say earlier than Richard Strauss, something between Bruckner and Strauss, something that could have been written by anyone in 1890, really. And I think this fact shocked a great many people who had expected something very different from me. It was in part a disciplinary exercise, but not so completely that I, even today, look upon it as something that I wouldn't want to repeat. In fact, at the moment I'm writing a work which in style at least is not so very different from this, using slightly different constructive aims, but not so very different. But I'll play a little bit of it at a point after a very long introduction in which finally you get an allegro tempo and a long first theme, which is this. And which is played in the viola. And will you turn pages for me?
Sure.
Can't possibly manage this on the piano. This gives way to a second theme, which is the old motive turned upside down. and so on. And thus ends the exposition.
It's very interesting because it seems to me, that's the first time I've ever heard it, it seems to me to combine a number of things which you've been talking about from Bach right through to Webern as far as that's concerned.
Well, it attempted to be an incorporation of many things which I believe really in music. And I don't know how possible this mixture really is. All of the people of the post-Wagnerian generation attempted gradually to bring principles of motivic organization into music, but they did it rather more with a regard for the big thing, the grand line, than I am doing here, which is really attempting to integrate all of the lines into something that makes sense, almost independent of each other, and yet at the same time are constricted by the great need for doing all this within a very firm harmonic idiom, and having to conform to the bar line in that sense.
You've said a good deal already about your interest in German music, or at least the Germanic tradition coming down into the late 19th century. Do you actually not find, say, French music or Spanish music or Italian music as interesting?
No, I don't, frankly. There are individuals that I admire from time to time. I love Bizet, for instance. A marvelous composer. But with the exception of Bizet, let's see, who else do I like? Rameau to a degree. Cherubini, wonderful composer.
You don't find yourself wanting to play Chopin, for instance?
No, I don't. It's something that just doesn't go on me. I play it in a weak moment, maybe once a year or twice a year for myself. But it doesn't convince me. It doesn't make me happy. When I hear it superbly played by the right person, I can be convinced by it, if only briefly. I think that Chopin, I don't mean to sound condescending, because this sounds just plain silly to say it in this way, but to put it honestly, I think that Chopin was a fascinating composer. I don't think, however, that he was a great composer. It seems to me that in the bigger things of music, in the real organizational attempts, he failed almost altogether. I think that as a miniaturist, he was superb. As a setter of moods, unparalleled. As someone who understood the piano, certainly unprecedented, and probably no one has ever managed to do it that well. But still in all, he is not a composer that I rest easy with.
It's not enough for you, then, that the composer be a pianist's composer in the sense of knowing exactly what you can get from the piano and exploring.
No, as a matter of fact, most of the composers that I play for other reasons altogether. Some of them happen to be people who write well for the piano. It seems to me that if you once get it in your blood, Bach can sound superbly well on the piano. But he certainly is not considered to be a person who wrote well for the piano. In many respects, Beethoven didn't write that well for the piano either, and certainly Schoenberg didn't. But that doesn't seem to really matter. I don't think that the yardstick of effect, of successful effect, has very much to be said for it in the long run, because this does not have anything to say about whether or not the music will last in the bloodstream.
What composer would you say has written most perfectly for the piano?
Well, I think I would be like everybody else and probably say Chopin. In this, if the piano means to you what it meant to Chopin, let's put it that way, it doesn't mean that to me, because if the piano is to be used to its fullest, it means an indulgence in many things which I have a very strong aversion for. One of them is the pedal. I don't know where this came from, possibly from the fact that on the organ one doesn't have it. One doesn't have anything to produce a sustaining sound except the pillars of the church. But some way or other, I developed a very real antipathy for playing with any indulgence of the pedal whatever, except as a punctuating factor, as something to mark the beat by a slight excess of or luster of sound. I use it for this reason. In fact, I have a bad habit of stamping on it for exactly that reason. But to use it in the sense of coloring things or adding things to the score, this is something that I had a very great dislike of and suspicion of. And in fact, has always I'm afraid, to an extent, colored my judgments about other pianists, because the ones that I admire most greatly are those who use the pedal very sparingly. In this occasion, curious enough, I have to accept Schnabel, because Schnabel actually was an inveterate pedaler. But that, I have a feeling, Schnabel was not a love for the pedal. It was to cover up certain technical blurbs that he was always making. You know, I think it was a physical deficiency. I want to think so. I insist upon thinking so.
I have the impression from what you've been saying that it's the, if you like, the architecture in music that fascinates you.
Yes, it is. It really is. Much more than the applicability of a particular group of sounds to an instrument. It really is much more open kind of thing.
Which begins with Bach, I suppose, and comes right down to Webern. And I'd like to ask you something about 12-tone music, about which most of us are confused, to say the least. What do you find in common between Bach, whose melodies and whose rhythms are immediately accessible to almost everybody, and, say, Webern, whose melody or lack of it?
Well, if the question were of Bach and Schoenberg, it would be easier to answer, frankly, because between those two, there are great semblances. You know, the principles of Baroque counterpoint, of endless ebb and flow of music, it seems to me, have never been more fully found in the 20th century than in the music of Schoenberg, at least in certain areas of it, in the classical periods of his 12-tone writing of the 1925, 1935 decade, which I think from which come some of the most wonderful things, in which, to a certain extent, he was even working with Baroque forms in a slightly self-conscious but justified attempt to control this new medium, this 12-tone row, which he was using to put it into forms which were immediately known, the binary minuet, for instance, in which he writes in this way. And this is music in which the 12-tone technique is being used rather primitively by our standards today, or at least by our practices today, not by our standards. But nevertheless, in a wonderfully vital and really neoclassic way, in which all of this music has this wonderful air of discovery that something was so fresh and so unique that it simply could be channeled into anything, even a little minuet form, you know. That's
a sound that's a good deal less strange, I must admit, than most of Webern.
Yes. Well, with Webern, you get, to an extent, a transference of certain principles of Schoenberg with an omission of others. And you get also many things which are completely new to music up to his time, because Schoenberg was not in, Webern rather, was not in the Schoenbergian sense a contrapuntist. He never wrote music in which really complex polyphony, in the sense of Schoenberg or in the sense of the 19th century post-Wagnerians, was involved at all. With Schoenberg, it was a question of making in a perfectly classical way 3 or 4 voices move simultaneously against each other, and recognizing each of them as independent entities, but nevertheless involved in the same forward motion and responding to the same urge to coalesce at the bar line and to form an accent, you know. And this was the whole principle of that music. There's a wonderful passage in Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus when Adrian Leverkuhn, who was modeled rather maliciously after Schoenberg as a 12-tone composer, is having a consultation with his friend, the narrator of the book. And his friend very perspicaciously, I think, says, well, Adrian, for all that you have developed the principles of harmony, for all that you have enriched the languages, I transcribe approximately, for all that you have enriched the language and have added dimensions of counterpoint that were undreamed of in previous generations, you remain rhythmically as foursquare as any of we Germans. And this is absolutely true about Schoenberg and about, in fact, most of the 12-tone tradition in Germany. But with Webern, gradually, as he assimilated what the 12-tone technique meant to him, it became a very personal kind of expression in which individual intervals, usually of 2 notes only, formed or represented an entire phrase, an entire idea, as much as would 2 or 3 bars of statement in more conventional music. Now, these were not, I think, breakdowns of as somebody once expressed it, novels into size. I don't believe this at all. I think that they simply represented a plateau of possibility, and it was this putting together of many such angles and squares and rectangles of sound in Webern that produces the total effect, whereas in Schoenberg, in this way, in the rhythmic dimension, everything plows forward together firmly. In fact, I'll play you a little bit of the variations, which is his only work for piano and is in 3 brief movements. And the last movement is very lyrical, even very tender in some ways, and is occasionally confined just to 1 note here, 1 note there, in the top and the bottom, spaced apart but belonging together in the mind.
that sound of Webern is still in the air, I'd like to go to the other end of your musical spectrum to Bach. It might be interesting to get the comparison.
Mm-hmm. Well, why don't I play a little bit of the Art of the Fugue, then?
Fine. Glenn, do you play the Bach fugue that you just played as you played it, say, 5 years ago, or have your interpretations changed?
Not substantially, actually. I don't recall exactly how I played it 5 years ago, but by and large, I think that my interpretations of Bach remain much more static than of most other composers, possibly because I'm happier with Bach, and there seems less reason for doing this and that differently. There may be reasons, many of them, but they not reasons which interest me terribly. Whereas with many another composer, with Mozart, for instance, I'm forever changing this and that. Never quite happy with what I do.
What brings about the change?
Well, usually listening to playbacks of something, or listening to recordings that you've made, or something taken off the air from an old performance, and thinking in terms of 6 months later and saying, good heavens, how did I ever do that, you know? And at the time, something that was perfectly acceptable, it suddenly seems quite incomprehensible to you, and you simply got to rework the whole thing and withdraw it from your repertoire for 3 or 4 months and sit and look at it again.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever been interested in jazz?
Not interested. I tolerate it. I listen to it with mild enthusiasm in my teens, and still do listen to it with mild enthusiasm in very small doses. But I have absolutely no ability for it whatsoever. It requires a much stronger conception of the third triplet on the beat than I have. I simply can't think this way. As a matter of fact, I can recall that when I first learned the Beethoven Sonata Opus 111, there is a section in the last movement which begins... And this was for me the most absolutely impossible thing to grasp. For months and months, I dreamt about this. I thought about it day and night. How one could possibly think in terms of and because one is so used to splitting the beat in even sections in classical music.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Glenn, how old are you now?
26.
And you're part of a generation, includes Lois Marshall, Teresa Stratus now, John Vickers, who are all singers, of course, Betty Jean Hagan, the violinist, the post-war generation of young Canadian performers who have made very considerable marks around the world. How do you account for this extraordinary burst of musical talent in Canada, and as it happened, mostly from Toronto, or at least the training was mostly in Toronto? Most of it took place just after the war, didn't it?
Yes, it did. I don't know, really. I don't see any reason that it shouldn't have happened, though. It's only amazing to me that it didn't happen some years ago.
But now we have both performers and composers as well. The whole musical climate seems to have changed.
I think during and since the war, the climate for composers especially has changed immensely because there has been so much immigration of people from Central and Eastern Europe who had very sound musical backgrounds of diverse kinds. Mm-hmm. And this has been the healthiest thing which could have happened because there have been 12-tone composers of caliber of Istvan Anhalt in Montreal, and people of a more conservative bent like Oskar Moravec, who came from Czechoslovakia. And this has added, I think, immeasurably to music in Canada. Not that their works or they themselves are very well known, perhaps, but that they are around, they have teaching position, that they influence the younger people and so on. And not only influence them individually, but collectively show that there are many directions that this thing may take, that music at the moment is at a crossroads, and that there are so many possibilities for it that everybody has a chance to be right, really, you know. And I think this is a fascinating thing in a country like Canada, much more so than in the European countries, where although there is no longer a national tradition, there's no longer a Viennese school, it broke up in the 30s, there's no longer a German theater, really. It consists of influence of the French, of Italian and so on. But nevertheless, to an extent, there still does exist music that is in some way identifiable with the country, whereas in Canada and the United States, it doesn't exist at all. Everybody is for himself, which is, in one sense, a bad thing, but on the other hand, it is a tremendous strength individually. But there is a lot of Canadian music which is, I think, of first-rate caliber. There are a few things which are extraordinary. There's one work which I recorded a number of years ago for the CBC, and which I still play from time to time. I'm going to play again this season. And that's a terrific fantasy by Oskar Moravec. He's written several pieces with that title, but this one is the first of them. It's one which most people, for some reason, ignore, and I think it's a shame, because not only I think it's his finest work for the piano, but I think it's one of the very finest things of its genre, which is approximately that of the, East European school of Czech, even Russian influence. There's a lot of Prokofiev in this piece. It was a composer that I have certain admiration but reservations about. But this, I think, is better than anything Prokofiev ever wrote for the piano. And it has one quality which very, very little Canadian music has that has come into my hands, and that is that it thinks big. I'll play a little bit of it. It's wonderful music. so on.
I see what you mean about thinking big.
Yes.
It's a beautiful thing. Glenn, what do you do in your off hours?
Well, mostly I sit around up in the country, which is at the top end of Lake Simcoe, and look at the trees.
Do you read?
Yes, a great deal. This is... well, actually, if I had not turned out to be a musician, I think the thing I would most like to have done would have been to be a writer.
Really?
Hmm?
Not an actor? You're a very good mimic.
Well, the ham is in me in large proportion, but I think in the end I would have wound up doing something that I could have done on my own time. Mm-hmm. And writing appeals to me very much. It's confined at the moment to writing my own jacket notes for recordings and things like that, and the odd lecture on something.
Do you mean writing on music or writing fiction?
Well, the only thing I've ever done is write on music, but I've always been strongly tempted to try writing fiction. I'm completely unprepared for it. It would be a real gamble, but one of these times I'll write my autobiography, which will certainly be fiction.
You like the theater, though?
Yes.
Do you go very often?
Not as often as I have opportunity for. Again, for the same reasons that I'm a bad sightseer and a bad tourist. I go when I'm not working, especially when I'm in New York or something and I'm not working. But I miss wonderful opportunities to go to theaters on the continent and so on when I'm there, simply because I don't feel I can afford the time.
Mm-hmm. The musical theater, does it appeal to you? Opera?
Well, actually, no. I am not an opera fancier, with two exceptions: Mozart and Richard Strauss, both of whom I adore. I'm extremely interested in Wagner, but I'm not really that fond of Wagner theatrically. I'm much more interested in Wagner musically. And since Wagner didn't want himself to be separated in his parts, therefore, apparently, I'm not a real Wagnerian.
Yeah.
But the thing which is absolute anathema to me is Italian opera. I simply cannot. I squirm with Verdi and wiggle with Puccini. I'm intensely uncomfortable in this music.
Do you go to concerts?
No, almost never. I think I've been to about 3 concerts in the last year, all of which were by friends of mine, and it was a political, diplomatic duty to go. Mm-hmm. I'm extremely uncomfortable at concerts, in fact. I find that for me the real approach to music is sitting at home, is the narcissistic one, is listening to recordings. I'm intensely uncomfortable when I have to project within myself what must be going through the mind of somebody else, since I know what goes on up there, you know.
Yes.
I'm much too close to the business to enjoy it in that way.
Yeah.
But I love listening to recordings where nothing can go wrong. It's done, and that's that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The majority of musicians, I imagine, find the same experience when they go to concerts.
I think so, quite probably.
Yeah. What about your home in Lake Simcoe? Nice, quiet, secluded spot. Haunted, at least the area is haunted by 2 remarkably opposite personalities, Champlain and Stephen Leacock.
Yes.
Were you brought up in the shadow of Stephen Leacock? You live almost across the street from his home.
Well, yes. Not only was I brought up in the shadow of Stephen Leacock, but all of the local habitants treat me in approximately the way they treated Stephen Leacock circa 1912 when he wrote about them in Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town.
For which they've never really forgiven him.
No, but I've told one of my farm neighbors that after I'm dead and gone, she can have the pop concession when they turn my place.
Actually, do you enjoy the seclusion of living?
It's wonderful. It's the most tremendous relief to get hotel living out of your system and be completely alone for a few weeks at a time. And in fact, this is where the work goes on. I seldom practice on tour due to difficulties in finding a good piano in a warm hall.
Yeah.
And this is really where the work goes on, where I prepare new things and rework old ones. And especially during the winter when it's very quiet and the lake is frozen and there's nothing but ice and snow as far as you can see. And
all this suggests that you actually are very happy living in Canada.
I have absolutely no intention or desire to leave Canada. I can't see, first of all, any reason for it. Canada's been terribly good to me. And secondly, I'm much too fond of the country.
Mm-hmm. Someday, I hope, somebody's going to write some music that is right for our North Country in the sense in which Sibelius has been right for Finland. Do you know of any? Do you know...
No, not really. Harry Summers wrote a remarkably nice piece some years ago about the North Country, or at least influenced by it, apparently. But
when you're
Sibelius is remarkably right for me. I play Sibelius a great deal when I'm up there in the country.
You do?
Oh, yes. Music like this. What incredible music.
Do you remember the ending? Do you remember the ending? The melody comes back in the violin.
Oh, yeah. Wait a moment. Oh, yeah. I can't remember exactly. And then just before the ending, you get this wonderful. Isn't this before the end? You get the.
Yes.
I was brought up in the Mengelberg performance of this wonderful music, wonderful recording with the Concertgebouw.
So on and so weiter.
Yeah. Well, now let's try a little with Bruckner. Something's very quiet so that we can speak fluently over it. I remember one time that I said to Anton, Anton, if I must always write something in G-flat major, because really it is a very ordinary key. Everybody in our generation, which of course 1880, was writing G-flat major. You know, it made... Well, he could have done better, actually. His publishers were always coaxing him to write something in G major, and you think he would do it? Never. Always G-flat, D-flat, A-flat, you know, very sexy keys, but he would never try to really do what he could in G major. I mean, just imagine what he could have done in G major. You know, it would have sounded so clear, so bright, so sparkling. It would have projected something that all the Germans were waiting for at that time, but he just didn't do it. Always, you know, it was so deep, so dark, so purple. Yeah. It was Weltschmerz in music, yeah.